forces arrayed against us are, and I use the word most carefully, formidable. They are entrenched and powerful. They are, as I've taken some pains to explain, the forces of imperialism acting through their instruments, neocolonialism and colonialism, ably assisted by the agents of the Cold War. They operate in worldwide combinations at all levels: political, economic, military, cultural, educational, social, and trade. And not all, and through intelligence, cultural, and information services. They operate from European and African centers, using agents who, I'm ashamed to say, are often unpatriotic sons of Africa, buying personal satisfactions with the betrayal of their country's safety and integrity. They seduce leaders. They seduce leaders of the African political, trade union, and people's organization, thus creating rifts and quarrels within the national front. On the broader front, they are amassing their forces in a determined effort to stay the advance of African liberation and the march of unity. It is not accidental that the countries of the European Common Market and those spearheading the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, the imperialist powers who have brought in their vassals, Spain and Portugal. Portugal, in fact, since the wars of the Spanish succession, 1700 to 1714, being a protectorate of Britain, which has enjoyed special trading and unnecessary rights in both Portugal and in the Portuguese territories for over 200 years. It is not difficult to understand, therefore, why Britain has not raised her voice against the atrocities in Angola and other protected Portuguese territories, and actually supported Portugal's preposterous claim at Goa in India, was an integral part of the metropolitan country. The arms and troops that are pouring into Angola cannot be regarded in isolation from the international organization of imperialism and the Cold War militarism with which they are most definitely linked. It is absurd to think that Portugal, one of the poorest countries in Europe, it's a fact, could support so large an army, so well equipped, as that which he defended her colonial possession in Africa, without the active aid he must be receiving from the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. Nor can we look upon the way in which South Africa is busily building up an armed force equal to any held by the nations of Europe, without sending the international implications that are obviously involved. She has, we hear, a secret military pact with Portugal, and the interlocking imperialist interests collected in the Congo and the Rhodesias, Angola and Mozambique, which are also linked with the great mining and financial interests operating in South Africa, create a chain of allies which seriously threatens both the fight for extending African emancipation from colonialism and independence of the new African states. Now that African independence has been achieved over a large part of the continent, and the national consciousness of Africans from north to south, from east to west, is adding momentum to the struggle for independence. Every kind of means is being used by the colonialists to arrest its progress and defeat its objective. They are attempting many methods, some sinister, some beguiling, to wreck our efforts. They strike antipathetic postures On one side, they perform acts calculated to strike fear. On the other, they try to hoodwink us with fictitious gifts, which superficially pander to our hopes and aspirations. They are the president's attempts to deflect our purpose, to weaken our determination.
Yes, greetings, guys. If you can hear me, you should put a one in the chat section if you can hear me very well and clearly. Thank you very much. Today we are going to tackle a very interesting subject, and for that matter, a very interesting personality. If you can hear me, please put a one in the chat section. Put the one in the chat section. Okay, excellent, excellent. Thank you so much. So today we are going to look at a very important figure. Um, he's a very special figure who is Dr. Kwame Nkrumah. Dr. Kwame Nkrumah's story is the story of Africa. And of course, the story of Africa is the story of Marcus Garvey. And the story of Marcus Garvey is the story of all African people across the globe because of so much inspiration he brought to the African continent. Now, Nkrumah, of course, as a figure, achieved a lot. Today was dedicated to him in Ghana. It is actually in the constitution as his birthday. Today is the day when he was born. Nkrumah was born in September, so they say, September 21st, on the September 21st of 1909. So his day is a public, his birthday is a public holiday in Ghana, and in fact, all over the African continent, that particular day is celebrated. Not even the birthday of Nelson Mandela is celebrated all across the world, but of course, Nkrumah is celebrated. And why is this? This is what we want to look at. As we have seen that the topic of the day is Kwame Nkrumah's birthday, his legacy in a changing world order. And can Nkrumah continue to guide us even today, looking at what we are facing? So basically, what we are going to look at today is Nkrumah as a person. Where did he come from? Who is he as a person? As Nkrumah, who is Nkrumah as a person? All right. Uh, Let me see here. Who is Nkrumah as a person? Did he come from a rich background? All right. What drove him and what really defined him as a person? Nkrumah. And then we will look at his legacy, of course. Has Dr. Nkrumah's legacy really been followed by by those who came after him? Because Nkrumah represents the first generation after independence, all right? And Nkrumah did not only inspire uh, the independence movement on the African continent, but he also inspired the Africans in the diaspora. And we saw people like, Dr. King coming to the continent, Malcolm X, Muhammad Ali, all these big figures, lived on the continent, George Padmore, W.E.B. Du Bois. So Nkrumah's story, that is why I said, is the story of Marcus Garvey. And Marcus Garvey's story is the story of Africans at home and abroad, because Marcus Garvey attempted to unify the African people all across the world. And Nkrumah himself was inspired by Honorable Marcus Garvey, looking at whatever he achieved. But now, what makes Nkrumah very relevant today is the fact that he has continued, his ideas have continued to inspire even today. His prescriptions to the problems of the African continent and the African people globally have continued to inspire us, the next generation. If you look at people like me, I was born way long after Nkrumah had died in 1972. But I come to meet some of his writings later on in 2014, 2012, 2014. And when you read what he's saying in his works, you get inspired to do something about the situation. You get inspired to move in a different direction. You get convinced that something must be done about the African situation. And so here we are. So this is the figure of Nkrumah. But what we want to understand is where he came from, briefly, because as a person we cannot go in detail. Huge books have been written about him. He left a book himself called Ghana, the autobiography, which is basically about his life until he became the president of Ghana, prime minister and president of Ghana, later on in 1960 when Ghana became a republic. And we have another person who has really written a very good book about him. She's called Ama Baine, and that book is called The Political and Social Thought of Kwame Nkrumah. It is a book which I've found to be one of the best books which have been written about Nkrumah, even though it is lacking in one way or the other. But it is one of the best books which have been written out there. That book is called The Political and Social Thought of Kwame Nkrumah. It's a very important book. And if you are out there, whether you're in the diaspora, whether you're on the continent, you need to read that book because it shows, of course, some of the works he did and in some way or somewhat uh, portrays Nkrumah's genius, how he was able to achieve a lot of things. So that is a very important book. So a lot of work has been written about him. A lot of books have been written about him. Even in that book itself, which I mentioned, The Political and Social Thought of Kwame Nkrumah, Ama Baine says that since she grew up, she's a Ghanaian who grew up in Britain, in the United Kingdom. She found Nkrumah at school, and what she heard about him, she found him to be a figure who was larger than life. And what makes Nkrumah larger than life basically is his achievements. And these achievements, of course, they are recognized by those who revere him like us, but also those who hate him. All right, those who loathe him, people like President Nanado, we will not leave him out. We see him that even though his group, the group he comes from, they loathe Nkrumah, but to some extent, of course, they also respect him, looking at what he achieved and the fact that President Nanado himself has been a president who has not achieved very much compared, to Nkrumah. If you compare him to Nkrumah and whatever has been done, so Nanado, even though he has criticized Nkrumah on numerous occasions, even when he came to power. But later on, we see Nanado going to inaugurate a mausoleum in the middle of Accra, a mausoleum which is basically a burial place for Nkrumah. He went and rehabilitated it and into a tourism, of course, attraction. And he went and inaugurated it himself. He did not even send the minister of tourism. So he is still, as Nkrumah, respected by even those who hate him because of what he achieved. It is difficult even to understand how Nkrumah was able to achieve so much in such a short time. Maybe you can say he's almost similar to Tupac Shakur, who died at just 25 years. But if you look at what he achieved, he achieved so much. Maybe it is because he spoke to the problems of the time, and those problems have continued to persist. They spoke to inherent sort of problems, that those problems we have to tackle them as Black people in such a way that we have to work together before we can solve these problems. And those problems, of course, they spoke about, both of them, both Kwame Nkrumah and Tupac. Those problems have not gone away. The problems they spoke about, the problems have not gone away. But briefly, of course, let us go and look at Dr. Nkrumah himself. And we'll use a simplified version because we want to go through it real quick. We want to run it through real quick. So we'll use a simplified version, which is accessible to everyone, basically everyone. And that is Wikipedia. We'll use Wikipedia for now. I will not go into the books because the books are very long. And so you need to take time to read it. So basically, Nkrumah was born, like I said, in 1909, in September, 19. 1909, 21st September 1909. That is when he was born, and then he was born to his mother. He was the only child of his mother. Nkrumah was the only child of his mother, and he grew up and he was able to go to school. So he was educated as a teacher, and he started teaching even at Achimota School in the year 1930. In 1930, when he started teaching at Achimota College, that is where he found somebody very important, actually. And that important person was called Kwajiri Agre. That gentleman was called Kwajiri Agre, who worked at Achimota. Now, this gentleman is inspired Nkrumah so much that Nkrumah took on, in some way, took on his thinking. He took on the thinking of Kwajiri. And Kwajiri, how did he inspire, Nkrumah? Is through the works of course, Honorable Marcus Garvey. We are talking about 1930, this period. Now, Kwajiri had these books and philosophies of Marcus Garvey, some of the writings of Honorable Marcus Garvey. So this led to Nkrumah start reading and understanding Kwajiri, because Kwajiri was about Africans respecting themselves and self-determination. All right. So that is where Nkrumah then started learning about Marcus Garvey. Now, in 1935, Nkrumah went to the United States to study. And in the United States, Nkrumah was able to gain, he arrived in the United States in 1935, and he was able to study and get a degree in economics and sociology in 1939, as we are seeing. He gained another degree in which was a Bachelor of Theology, a degree from Lincoln in 1942, and he was the top student in his class, actually. And during that period, he also got a Master of Arts degree in philosophy, and a Master of Science in education. So he was really educated. Now, Nkrumah also lived in Harlem. And for those of you who are African Americans, or who are, Africans in the diaspora, you know that this was a hot spot for African or culture, sort of, or African American culture, Harlem. So Nkrumah went and lived in these places. Now, according to Dr. Henrik Clark, this period in which Nkrumah lived in the United States affected him a lot, because he got to experience racism a lot. He got to experience racism firsthand, and what the Africans on the other side of the Atlantic were going through. Some of us have read the books about racism. We have read books about the civil rights movement. If you are talking about Dr. Martin Luther King, we have read books about incarceration. I think this lady is called Michelle, who wrote the book called The New Jim Crow. There's a lady is called Michelle, who I've forgotten her name, but she wrote the book called The New Jim Crow. So we got to read about slavery, we got to read about civil rights movement and the Jim Crow era, and we got to read about what is happening even right now, that the Africans in the United States are arrested, or they are incarcerated, imprisoned, to the extent to, they constitute about 50% of the prisoners in the United States, even though they constitute, less than 14% of the total population. So this speaks to a system, continuous system, which comes from slavery, to all the way Jim Crow, and even to today, where the racism continues and police continues to kill the African people in the United States, or the African Americans, however you call it, depending on what you think. But we got to read about these things, but Nkrumah got to experience it himself, and to see what was happening. And then he got to do some dirty jobs, in many cases, to be able to afford the United States as he was living there. But, unlike other people who had gone to the United States to stay forever and to make it a home, or even to run away from what they call the bad conditions on the African continent, Nkrumah had a plan or had a dream, even though he didn't know how it was going to be realized during that period. He had a dream of coming back to Africa and contributing to the development of Africa. So after 10 years in the United States, he passed it through London. And when he was leaving the United States, he came and coming to Manchester, he spoke to a gentleman who's called C.L.R. James. C.L.R. James, for those of you who don't know him, is the one who wrote the book The Black Jacobins. And if you're African American, or I mean, if you're an African, I would encourage you to read that book because it is very, very important. That book is extremely important. It puts the Black history, the African history in perspective. And even when you read it and you compare to what is happening today, actually, you can see a lot of resemblance between what happened in 1791 to 1805, 1945, and then even what we are happening, what we are going through today, what is happening today, which is 2000 all the way to this period that we are in. There is a lot of similarities within this period. So when you hear people saying we are living in a changing world order today, so this is basically what people mean. This is what people are talking about, that these things which have happened through history, these events that have happened through history, they are similar in a way. And when we talk about 1945, Nkrumah was instrumental, was one of the most instrumental Africans during this period. So Nkrumah got to learn a lot from the African diaspora, and he got to learn a lot from how the United States itself was built, and got to learn its policies, of course, on the international stage. But he also, at the same time, Nkrumah hoped that the United States would, of course, help Africa in one way or the other, which we will talk about later. Now, Nkrumah, when he was leaving the United States, of course, he spoke to C.L.R. James as he was leaving and going to Manchester, and he asked him if he knew about any revolutionaries who were working for the interests of Africa. And we know that C.L.R. James, of course, is a diaspora Africans. And he's asking him during this period, and he's the only person he could find to ask, of course, know that the African diaspora, for over 500 years, they were the ones who were at the center of agitating for the liberation of the African continent. So that is where we get the thinking. Most of the Pan-Africans get the thinking. We, the Pan-Africans, get the thinking that you cannot liberate the African continent without the diaspora. So this has to be very clear. So regardless of the weaknesses that we have within the African diaspora, of course, we have these problems where the African diaspora now, they are divided, and of course we have the Republicans on the other side, we have the Democrats on the other side. People have been divided, but beyond that, we have the internal divisions which are being instigated, of course, by the United States establishment, like the FBI and the CIA, and all the, dividing the people into fundamentally black, white Americans, and then we have African descendants of slaves, all these groups. But the point is that all Africans are Africans, regardless of where you are. You have never seen Europeans, this we have spoken about it extensively. You have never seen Europeans when they have gone to the United States, completely extricating themselves from Europe. You have not seen this. Even when they go to Europe, and even when they get out of Europe and they come to the United States, they, Canada, where they are, these are all Europeans. They never say, oh, we are fundamentally European, or whatever we are, or we are the European descendants of enslavers. You have never heard something like that. So sometimes it becomes really funny. Oh, you have never heard the whites in South Africa saying that we are the European descendants of the colonizers, putting those labels on yourselves. So we have these problems, which are to some extent are divisions within the African diaspora. But of course, with these divisions, still we know that these are African people, all right, regardless of whatever is happening there. We know that they are African people, and it is clear that they have driven, or they drove the independence movement, the thirsty for freedom, the struggle for freedom for the African people globally. They drove it for almost 500 years before the Nkrumahs, the Africans, arrived on the scene, okay, and started agitating. So Nkrumah had a lot to learn from the African diaspora, and so This is how he comes in contact with CLR James. And CLR James, actually, he directed him to another important person who would later become very important in the struggle for independence and the direction of the African continent, actually. And he was also an African diaspora, and that was called George Padmore. George Padmore was living in Manchester during that period, and all these guys actually had sacrificed their own lives and dedicated their lives to the pursuit of African freedom. All right, so they never put a line between themselves, and the Africans on the continent. There was no such thing. All of us looked at ourselves as Africans because we are facing the same enemy, and that enemy was imperialism. And of course, that is one thing which worries me when we look at today, that there's these divisions which are being sold by the FBI and the CIA and the United States establishment and the all imperialist establishment. And this, you don't even need to listen just to me. You can read it through the memorandum, National Security Memorandum 46, NSC 46, which was published, I think, in 1978. Okay, in which the United States FBI, in departments, and CIA, FBI, they are talking about dividing the Africans on the continent and those in the diaspora so that they don't come together to coordinate their activities, so that they will not know each other. So they instigated certain activities there, and they pumped, of course, a lot of money into these kind of activities. So we have to understand that the African diaspora, you can call them the Jamaicans, you can call them the African Americans, you can call them Barbadians, whatever you can call them, they have a role to play in the African continent. Therefore, you cannot build the African continent. I strongly believe that you cannot build the African continent without the diaspora. And that is why actually most of the building on the African continent has failed. This is very important. So Nkrumah understood this. Now, when Nkrumah arrives in Manchester, he's directed to a gentleman called George Padmore. And George Padmore would become a very important figure in Nkrumah's government. He was the one who used to advise Nkrumah on African affairs, actually, and yet he was African diaspora, on how Nkrumah to govern. Some people even, they called him Nkrumah's. He was Nkrumah's mentor to a certain extent, because George Padmore was sort of more experienced, and he was a very smart person, and actually, even other people have suggested that when George Padmore died, Nkrumah started making a lot of mistakes. Why? Because they say that George Padmore, to some extent, was the ideological engineer of whatever Nkrumah was doing, in Ghana and in Africa. And of course, Nkrumah would team up with other, African diaspora, like Arthur Lewis, who was a very genius economist. And Arthur Lewis, who was an African diaspora, is the one who drew up the first 5-year development plan for Ghana, under Nkrumah. So it is very important to understand the importance of African Americans. And we saw during this period that Ghana was making rapid development. Why? Because Nkrumah understood that you have to integrate the Africans on the continent and the Africans in the diaspora and bring all this power together. And of course, this is what the United States has been fighting against. Even when you look at the banning of African Stream, which is a main media platform on the African continent, and of course, it was trying also to bridge that gap in the diaspora to give a voice to the Africans. What the Biden administration and Blinken, Secretary Blinken, who was the Secretary of State, stated is that this platform claims that it is giving a voice to Africans on the continent and Africans in the diaspora, a voice. You see, so but then they blamed it for being a Russian platform, which is not true. We all know that this is not true, and we know from history that the United States and the imperialist powers have a history of dividing the Africans on the continent and the Africans in the diaspora so that they don't work together, because they know that this will bring down, will bring their downfall. All right. So Nkrumah meets George Padmore, and they organize together the 50th Pan-African Congress, which happened in Manchester, 1945. And that conference is the one which led to a lot of things which catalyzed the independence of African states later on. And Ghana would start. Nkrumah would return, of course, in 1947 to Ghana at the invitation of a certain group of people who belong to the same group as Nana Addo is today, to work with them. They had a vision for independence, but they did not know how to do it. They didn't have a strategy of achieving that independence in Ghana, and Nkrumah would rapidly help them to build systems. But Nkrumah realized that these guys, they had intentions of replacing the colonialists. And this is what alarmed actually Nkrumah when he was working with them. Now he decided to separate from them. Nkrumah decided to separate from them and form his own party, which is called the Conservative People's Party, which is the CPP. He formed his own party and then moved rapidly towards independence. He started organizing what he called positive action. Positive action basically means resisting the system and capitalizing on certain resistances, whether it is boycotts, and all this, and then building a system. And some people say he was inspired by Mahatma Gandhi and what he had done in India. So it is called sort of positive force resistance, basically resistance, resist to certain issues in the continent or in the country to the colonial administration. Now 1947 he came and organized the country in 1947, and later on in 10 years, from 1947 to 1957, that's a period of 10 years, Ghana was able to get its independence. So when Ghana got its independence, Nkrumah governed the country as as the prime minister until when he would become a full president in 1960, when Ghana became a republic, all the way to 1966, when he was removed from power as the president of Ghana and someone who was, of course, agitating for the unification of Africa. Later on, when Ghana immediately got its independence in 1957, Nkrumah immediately organized another conference in Accra, which was called, I don't remember the name, All African, I think, People's Congress, All Africa People, Conference, All Africa People's Conference, all right, to which he invited a lot of revolutionaries, invited almost all of them. They invited all of them. And of course, George Padma was at the center of this. And there's this gentleman who wrote the book, Wretched of the Earth, also was around. So most of the African diaspora and those Africans who were struggling for independence attended the All African People's Conference in Accra in 1958. And this was, of course, a catalyst for the liberation in other parts of the continent. Yes, we are talking about Fanon. Thank you very much, Bonsu Bigwell. He was around. Franz Fanon also was around during this conference, and many other Africans from across the continent. And he started, of course, giving a lot of support to liberation movements across the African continent. And then countries within a short period of time started getting its independence, their independence within a short period of time. 32 countries in 1963 at the formation of the Organization of African Unity, 32 African countries had gotten their independence. So this is where Nkrumah's, a genius started shining in how he handled the issue of the Democratic Republic of Congo. We saw that he played a very major, a very big role, because Nkrumah understood that for Africa to move forward, it had to take back the Democratic Republic of Congo and control it. He had to be in control of the Democratic Republic of Congo. So he played a major role in the Democratic Republic of Congo to try to help it have independence and also to bring it into a unison with Ghana. Actually, they signed even a secret pact, a secret agreement with the Prime Minister of Congo, Patrice Lumumba, and they had unified actually Ghana and the Democratic Republic of Congo into one country, which share a lot of things, almost similar to the Ghana, Guinea, and Mali Union, which was signed also, in which they attempted to unify the African continent. So until he would be overthrown with the help, of course, again, of the Americans, the CIA, the Central Intelligence Agency, the Imperialists, as they are doing today and disturbing everyone across the globe, they would overthrow his government in 1966. And I consider that period of his overthrow as the period when Africa was set back, was hugely set back. And it was not only Africa that was hugely set back, but even the African Americans in the United States were set back. Because remember, in 1957, when Dr. King attended the Independence Day celebrations of Ghana in March 1957, when he went back to the United States, Dr. King gave a speech, which speech was called The Birth of a Nation. So, in that speech, Dr. King attempts to talk about the events of what happened in Ghana. The speech is basically was inspired by what happened in Ghana. So, this is the reach. This is how far Nkrumah's influence reached in the African diaspora. So it touched, Dr. King himself, and it also touched Malcolm X. We know that Malcolm X came and visited Accra, and when he visited Accra, he went back a different person, Malcolm X, and that is when he formed the Organization of Afro-American Unity, which was a mimic of the Organization of African Unity during that period. But Malcolm X went back with a changed mind because of what because of the conversation he had with Nkrumah. He had extensive conversations with Nkrumah, and Nkrumah tried to show him that what you are fighting against is not basically racism, but you are fighting against imperialism. And what is haunting or oppressing the African people or people of African descent in the United States is the same thing that is oppressing the African people on the continent. So when Malcolm X goes back to the United States, he goes back a changed person, completely changed person who understands politics on geopolitical level. And it is simply because of this relationship that he struck up with Nkrumah. This is because of his conversation with Nkrumah. So we see that when Malcolm X comes back to the United States, forms the Organization of Afro-American Unity, and talks about, reuniting and speaking to Dr. King, even though they were, at odds during that period. And we see also that Malcolm X during this period is talking about taking the issues of the African Americans to the United Nations. And of course, the United States was threatened by this. And of course, this is the reason why they killed him. And this information, of course, has come out recently, whereby the FBI has been implicated in killing Malcolm X, even though they were blaming, of course, the nation of Islam. So I'm saying this just to show you Nkrumah's reach. Of course, Nkrumah had a lot of influence even on other countries globally, in Vietnam itself. He had gone, when he was overthrown in 1966, he had gone to negotiate for a ceasefire between the Vietnamese, the Viet Congs, and the Americans. His influence reaches all the way through the Soviet Union, even in the Caribbean. So this is the extent. The Black Panther themselves also, they were using some of Nkrumah's works. If you go and examine what the Black Panthers were doing, actually the Black Panthers were taking a lot of information from Kwame Ture, who was Stokely Carmichael. Stokely Carmichael, he was an instrumental part of the civil rights movement. We remember that he was part with Dr. King, but Stokely Carmichael would later come and live, in Guinea and marry, in Africa, of course. But he would take on to advance Nkrumah's thoughts later on when Nkrumah was removed from power, was overthrown from power, and he would start advancing Nkrumah's thinking, and he called it Nkrumah'ism. Actually, it was, I think, Stokely Carmichael who was the first person to coin Nkrumah, what he called Nkrumah'ism. Is because he was living for a long period under the tutelage of Dr. Kwame Nkrumah. So this is very important. Now, I want to show you how far, I'm saying all this to show you how far Nkrumah's influence went. It did not only go around the continent to the point that he sponsored a lot of fighters on the African continent who were fighting for independence, and they trained a lot of fighters, warriors, in Ghana, in schools, in the Kwame Nkrumah Ideological Institute. Even people like, Robert Mugabe was trained in Ghana before he would go back later to Rhodesia. And they trained a lot of people and gave a lot, practical help to other groups. Nkrumah was one of the people, one actually, or the only person who was really concerned about the state of the African continent. Even when you listen to the speech which we played first, you can see that he was always concerned and paying attention to what was happening everywhere on the African continent. Anywhere on the African continent, he's talking about Angola, he's talking about Rhodesia, he's talking about South Africa, he's talking about Kenya, he's talking about all these, talking about Somalia. He had his ear all over the African continent. So that is why we have never had any leader who was so much concerned, maybe you can say you can say Muammar Gaddafi, and you can talk of also, Thomas Sankara. These are the few people who would later on be concerned about the state of the African continent. And Marcus Garvey, of course, Marcus Garvey was concerned about, he was concerned with the affairs of the Africans all over the world. So we have had only a few people who are really concerned with the affairs of the African people all across the world. Very, very few leaders who have had that orientation. Until today, we have not had anyone. Today, we have not had anyone. Even when you look around the continent, you don't see any leaders. Even in the diaspora itself, we are still lacking, even in the diaspora. And that is simply because in the diaspora itself, it is simply because the NSC 46, that document, the memoranda, National Security Memoranda 1946, was implemented in the United States, and one of the strategies that was to be used in that document was to remove the leaders of the African diaspora, the African Americans, from the normal people, to put a wedge between them by bribing them, basically by giving them petty benefits. So this, we see it today, and it is happening. So we are lacking leadership both on the continent but also in the diaspora currently, and there has not been any leader who has come out to stand in that gap, in the gap which Nkrumah left, in the gap which Malcolm X left, in the gap which Marcus Garvey left, these gaps which Muammar Gaddafi and Thomas Sankara, these gaps which these leaders left. And this is a huge problem. So who is Nkrumah? Nkrumah can only be said to be a leader. Is many things, of course, to many people, all right? And of course, there's those who hate him. But even, as I said, many of them also respect him, even those who hate Nkrumah. But Nkrumah can be said to be a freedom fighter. From my understanding, he was a freedom fighter, and it's basically clear why he's a freedom fighter, with Ghana being the first country in the African sub-Saharan Africa to gain back its independence. So he was a freedom fighter. Nkrumah was a leader because of what he gave. They normally say that for you to understand a leader, to understand leaders, look at when there's trouble. During times of trouble is when you understand who the leaders are during those periods. So during times of crisis is when true leaders come out to demonstrate their leadership skills. So Nkrumah was a leader during a period when the black people were going through a very difficult time, and the continent was sinking under the boot and the oppression of imperialism. So Nkrumah can be said to be a freedom fighter, a leader. He could be called a politician because he dedicated all his life actually to politics. Nkrumah dedicated most of his life to politics in Ghana and the African continent and in the diaspora. Of course, he was a visionary. Nkrumah was a visionary simply because he had ideas, which ideas even continue to transcend time. Like I said, this is someone who died in 1972, but here I am. I was born way long after he had died, but his thinking continues to influence us. So this is what makes him a visionary, and his ideas. You can say whatever you want about of course, the African Union, whose flag is behind me, but the African Union itself, if it was not for Nkrumah, there would not be African Union. So he turned the ideas into reality. This is somebody. Sometimes I say that Nkrumah turned, what was a dream, what was Marcus Garvey's dream, into a vision, and that vision, we are yet to turn it into a reality. It has partly been realized, but it has not completely been realized, because Nkrumah's vision will be realized when we have rebuilt the African continent. We have reunified it and rebuilt it, because there's no way you can rebuild the African continent without unifying it. And that is why the African heads of state have failed. That is why for over 60 years after independence, the rebuilding of the African continent has failed, even under the guidance, or whatever it is you can call it, under the guidance of imperialists. The African continent has failed to be rebuilt to where it is supposed to be. And so we are mocked. All right, we are mocked all across the world. I remember there's an article which appeared in the Financial Times, in which one of these Western thinkers said that Africa is the problem to the global economy, simply because we constitute about 80%, 80 to 20% of the global economy as a population, right? 18 to 20%. But we in production terms, our productivity is just less than 3%, because that is what we contribute to the global economy. The global economy is around $101 trillion, and Africa contributes only about $3 trillion, $3.5 trillion. So it's less than 3%. So he said that we are consuming more than basically we are producing. So what he wanted to say that he did not write in that article is that the Africans basically are useless. All right, they are not useful to the world because they are consuming more than we are consuming more than we are producing. So we are producing below capacity. So, but what does this mean? This basically means that the heads of state have failed. The generation that came after the Nkrumah's has failed. And how has it failed? Look, when we had no independence, our share of global manufacturing, for example, was almost zero. All right, in 1950s, in 1950s. But when we gained independence, in 10 years, all right, up to 1970, Africa had captured about 1% of global manufacturing. All right, we had built up a couple of industries. Now look at to today. Today, when we look at the African continent, our contribution to global manufacturing is less than 1.9%. Just 1.9%. This is after 60 years. Now, if you go back to China, if you go to China and check what is happening in China, China, after its independence, 10 years after its independence in 1959, it had about 2 to 3% of global manufacturing, as a share of global manufacturing. But right now, China has 30%. That is after around 60 years of independence for China, 60 to 70 years of independence for China. Because China is I think, is celebrating 75 years as a unified state. All right, it's celebrating 75 years. But after 75 years, for China, it has captured 30%. So it shows you that whatever the African heads of state are doing is the wrong things. They are completely doing the wrong things. And we have to rethink. We have to approach development in a new way as Africans. So Nkrumah can be said to be a visionary, that he had these ideas which transcended time, that for us to rebuild the African continent, we have to unify, which they have failed. The African heads of state today have failed. And of course, this you have to blame it on all of us as Africans, and including the diaspora, because the African diaspora cannot only take the benefits, they have also to take the blame, because in the past they have led the drive for independence, the drive for liberation of the African people. The African diaspora have led this drive. Okay, so the blame now is to be carried by everyone, not a single person. The Africans ourselves, the African diaspora, and the African heads of state. Now, this means that we take the responsibility of identifying the problem. What is really the problem, against the African continent? Why is it not moving forward? And we don't even need to look further. We just need to go back to what Nkrumah wrote, what Marcus Garvey wrote, and examine these and implement them. We don't need even to write new books or do new analysis. Basically, we just need to adopt what they did, to our condition. So this is Nkrumah. He was a visionary. He was a teacher. Nkrumah was a teacher, and we know that professional, of course, he was a teacher, and he tried to teach the African people. All right, he tried to teach the African people, and even his contemporaries. Nkrumah was a prophet. You can call him a prophet. You can call him a sage. All right, or even you can call him a good shepherd. Nkrumah is someone who who spoke things, and they are happening today. You can talk of books like Neocolonialism, The Last Stage of Imperialism. Nkrumah wrote that book in 1965 when it was published. The Americans protested against the book. They protested against the book. Why? Simply because of how it was, it was showing how imperialism is penetrating, has penetrated the African continent, how it works. Basically, how imperialism works. He talks about Hollywood, how it is being used. He talks about the United States Information Agency, which was merged right now and put into the United States Department of State. And that is why we see that Blinken, people like Blinken, who's the Secretary of State, is very concerned about the information that is being put out by African Stream. He sees it as a threat to the United States because It is bringing enlightenment to the African people. So they don't want the African people to be enlightened. So the United States Information Agency was was absorbed by the United States Department of State. All right. So that's why it is operating. That is why we see that Blinken now thinks that he's supposed to take on this role of disseminating false imperialistic propaganda across the African continent, banning RT news on the African continent. And this is what we are seeing. Now, Nkrumah was a visionary in that he was able to see these things. He saw the use of religion. He saw the use of Hollywood. He saw the use of information propaganda and war, information warfare. He saw the use of FBI and Central Intelligence Agents. And Nkrumah saw all these and he wrote them in the book called Neocolonialism, The Last Stage of Imperialism. If you want to see this book, actually, if you can't read the whole book, just read one chapter. It is free online. You can go to Google and Google that book. Read the chapter called The Mechanisms of Neocolonialism. Only that chapter is a short one, is a short chapter. If you read that, even is almost like reading the whole book. So he talks about the United Nations, how it is used. He talks about the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund. Nkrumah talks about all these things. So this makes Nkrumah a prophet, some sort of prophet. And you can call him a good shepherd. In the Bible, for those who read the Bible, they say normally the good shepherd is the one who lays down his life for the sheep because he loves them. Nkrumah, you can say this is somebody who laid down his life. He was persecuted. Okay, in the Bible and all these books, they talk about persecution. But who was persecuted more than Nkrumah? Who was persecuted more than Martin Luther King? These are the true shepherds. A good shepherd lays down his life for the sheep he loves. People like Malcolm X, they were gunned down by the same imperialists. These people, they laid down their lives and they refused to be corrupted. They refuse to be corrupted. And Nkrumah, we see that Nkrumah is talking about that the imperialists, in the first speech which we played, they talk about Nkrumah. Nkrumah is saying that the imperialists use many tactics. They use some methods. He called them some sinister, some beguiling. They try to buy us. They try to hoodwink us with fictitious gifts. So fictitious gifts basically is corruption. They try to bribe you. They try to corrupt you out. And this is what is happening, that majority of our heads of state today on the African continent have not been able to survive this woodwinking. They have not been able to survive this corruption. Okay. So, and Nkrumah said that in some cases, they try to strike fear. All right. They try to use fear to intimidate you. And we saw this even in the life of Dr. Martin Luther King, that they used to call him, the FBI used to call him with threats. Even Malcolm X, they would call like Dr. King that he should strangle himself. He should commit suicide. All right. They would tell Dr. Martin Luther King that he should commit suicide. So this is basically what Nkrumah is talking about, that they use fictitious gifts. They use some sinister methods. They use methods which are sinister and some beguiling. You see, so they are hidden. They use hidden tactics, and some of the methods are completely satanic, which they are using, to blackmail you, to bribe you, and then they use intimidation. You saw that a lot of times in Nkrumah, there was attempted, bombings on his life. They wanted to bomb him, attempted, killing, on his life. So these are all methods, intended to instill fear in you so that you can abandon your objectives, so that you can abandon your aspirations. Okay, that's why Nkrumah is talking about in the speech that they try to use all these methods, which pander to our hopes and aspirations, because the hopes and aspirations of the African people is the reconstruction of the African continent, so that all African people on the continent and in the diaspora can live dignified lives, respected lives, and they can be respected by the rest of the world. And the imperialists, they do not want that. Led by the United States, of course. The imperialists, they do not want this. Completely don't want this. So they don't want the African people to be in a respected place. So Nkrumah can be looked at a prophet, a sage. It can be looked at as shepherd. And this is somebody who completely sacrificed his life for the good of us all as Africans. Nkrumah was a father. He was a son. He was an husband. And we know that he married his wife, of course, from Egypt. And his daughter even is currently living in Ghana. And she's contesting even for a member of parliament currently in this election that is coming. So we pray that Samia Nkrumah is. We pray the ancestors may help Samia Nkrumah so that she is voted and she becomes a member of parliament once again. So Nkrumah was a father, was a son, he was a husband. Nkrumah was an author, as you are seeing on our, as you are seeing on our a thumbnail. Nkrumah wrote books. He wrote books, and it is this writing. So he was an author. Uh, he wrote these books, and these books are the ones which have inspired many of us who were not born, when he lived. When he died, we were not born. Many of us never thought that we would be born, but we found this work. So he was an author. So he was many things. He wrote more than 23 books and pamphlets. So some people even ask, where did this man get the time to write these books? Currently, I'm trying to write my own book, and of course, it's a book about Africa. I'm trying to write a book about Africa and the African continent. It is not easy to write a book. This is not an easy task. But Nkrumah found time, even when he was a president, to write, groundbreaking books, informative books, and books which were futuristic and with a lot of information. So he was an author. So if you ask again, who was Nkrumah? Nkrumah was many things. And that is why his figure has continued on for a long time. He's one of the greatest leaders that the world has ever had. Because let me ask you this: how many sitting heads of state, have you seen that have been able to produce books when they are sitting, as presidents, and they have been able to produce all this much work? Even Lincoln was not able to do it. Okay, John F. Kennedy was not able to do it. Okay, so it's very few presidents who have had, even on the African continent and globally, very few presidents have been able to to accomplish whatever Nkrumah accomplished. So he was a leader, he was a politician, he had so many hats, he was putting on many hats. He was a visionary, he was a visionary, he was a teacher, he was a prophet, he was a sage, he was a shepherd, a good shepherd, who we say that looks for the sheep and takes care of his sheep and he lays down his life for the sheep. He was an author, and he was a father and husband and son. So basically, if we are talking about Nkrumah, I believe that we can spend the rest of the days sitting on this platform just talking about Nkrumah. So that is basically Nkrumah. Now, the other question which this leads us to, for us to ask, is when we look at Nkrumah's legacy, and this is the second part, because we say that we're going to look at three parts of who Nkrumah is, Nkrumah's legacy, and then how he continues to inspire us. What is the way forward now that we know Nkrumah's legacy and we know his history as as a person? What is the way forward for us as Africans? So the second part that we are looking at is, what is his legacy? When we look at his legacy, and people, heads of state, the current and gone heads of state, have they lived up? The current heads of state on the African continent, have they lived up to the expectations similar to what Nkrumah and his generation, achieved? Have they lived up to those expectations? And of course, this is a huge question in itself. And of course, all of us, I believe, in one way or the other, have our answers to whether the current heads of state have lived up to the expectation. And I think that we don't need to be simplistic about this question, but when we look at the affairs of the continent, the status of the African continent, even on the global stage, it is enough to show us whether they have lived up to Nkrumah's expectations. During Nkrumah's time, Africa was regarded, globally, to the point that we are invited to dialogue on international affairs. And that is why, of course, Nkrumah was invited to mediate the conflict between the United States and Vietnam, where he was overthrown from. But today, we are not invited. Even when we go in, for example, like how the African Union, under the leadership of President Cyril Ramaphosa of South Africa, when the African Union went to Ukraine to proffer a solution, you can see that the African heads of state were mistreated in Poland. They were treated like small children. And even Zelensky disrespected the African heads of state. It is until they reached Russia to Putin, that the African heads of state were respected. So you can see that there's no respect. When we go to the United Nations to speak, and this coming week, of course, the African heads of state will appear before the United Nations. The 79th United Nations General Assembly is happening this week, this coming week, and next week. African heads of state will be speaking there. But when the African heads of state are speaking, normally they are not respected. The rooms are empty. No one is there to listen to anything. So it means that they don't regard what we say. But when you look at Nkrumah, when Nkrumah was speaking at the United Nations, he was respected. Africa was respected during that period. And the room would be full when Nkrumah was speaking. You could see around the room. You can look for those videos on YouTube. Those videos are available on YouTube. That when Nkrumah was at the United Nations speaking, they knew that almost the president of Africa had come to the United Nations, and everyone would come in to listen at what Nkrumah was saying. So the state of the African continent currently also has so much to say of whether the African heads of state have lived up to the expectation. So what we can see currently is that there's a lot of failure on the African continent, huge failure. And of course, starts with what I've already mentioned, which is the failure to transform the African continent economically. And I've mentioned that at the close of 1970, the African continent had captured 1% of global manufacturing. But after 60 years, from zero, it had captured 1% of global manufacturing by 1970. And that was because of the work which was done by the African heads of state during that period, who were the independence movement. They were very nationalistic, regardless of the differences which they had within themselves, to the point, of course, that we had on one side the Casablanca group, and then we had the Monrovia group, to which which other heads of state who opposed Nkrumah. Nkrumah, of course, belonged to the Casablanca group. Belonged. There was those differences, but they were at least nationalistic. That when you go to places like Nigeria, a lot of industries had been put up. All right. A lot of industries had been put up in East Africa. A lot of industries had been put up in Ghana. A lot of industries to substitute manufacturing, as for import substitution, because we understood that without industrialization, we cannot go anywhere. All right. So Africa had captured about 1% of global manufacturing by 1970. Right now, we are at less than 2%, 1.9% of global manufacturing. So it shows you that we have not made any progress. We have not made any progress, considering that it has been more than 50 to 60 years of independence when these heads of state are running the continent. So that is a major failure. So it tells you that they are doing the wrong things. The African heads of state on the continent, they are moving in the wrong direction, completely wrong direction. And I've compared that with China. The fact that China has moved rapidly in the direction of advancement, that in 1970, in 1960, 1959, China had 3% of global manufacturing. Right now, it is 30%. It has 30%. China now has global manufacturing. It is a manufacturing powerhouse of the world. So it has more manufacturing than the United States. Its capacity, manufacturing capacity, is more than the United States, Japan, Germany, and India combined. That is how powerful China is. But it came from zero also. So this shows you that also Africa can do it. But we have to understand what the problem is. We have to understand that we have a problem at our hand, and especially this generation of Africans has to understand that our heads of state are going in the completely wrong direction, because everything starts with the leadership. Everything starts with the leadership system. Everything starts with the leadership system, and everything the leadership. Fail at that, then you have completely failed. That is why the United States and all the other imperialistic powers, they fought so hard to take over the political system on the African continent, because that is where everything is decided. It is politics which decides everything. If you say you don't want to play politics, if you say you don't want to do anything in politics, then you are digging grave for your own enslavement. So you have to participate as long as you are an African and as long as you are anyone across the globe. And I understand that many people don't want to participate in politics, but that is how it is. You have to participate whether you want it or not, because politics shapes your life, shapes everything about your life, whether it is taxes you pay, whether it is the identity card which you carry these days, whether it is how much you pay for your telephone calls, whether you is how much you pay for your sugar, whether whatever it is the government, it is the politics which decides everything. So that is why it is very wrong for people to say, oh, leave the state should not play an important role. They are lying to you. Even the United States and the West, which are claiming that it is the private sector which should drive, when they come to Africa, they don't work with the private sector, they work with the government. They are always looking for how to take over our governments. That is what it is. That is why they are interfering in our government. So why are they not concentrating on the private sector when they come to the African continent? So it shows you that if you fail at leadership, if your political system fails, then you are in trouble. You're not going to be able to produce leaders who are going to be able to transform your society. And contrary to what other people say, that Africa's problem is that there's no leaders. The leaders are there. That is a wrong thing. The leaders are there. We have the leaders. But the problem is the political system, that the political system we have does not allow the best in our society to come to the top and govern the continent. And I mean, look at places like Nigeria. It's just a simple example. Look at Nigeria. I mean, is Tinubu one of the smartest? Is he smarter than Dangote? Dangote, who has built a facility of $20 billion, and he's going to save the country more than 4% of its GDP. What has Tinubu done? He's instead destroying. And I remember Dangote was met as part of the economic management team, which was constituted by Tinubu, and Dangote advised them that don't increase the interest rate. Why are you increasing the interest rate? People cannot borrow to do business, but you are increasing the interest rates. So you can see that Tinubu is not the smartest person. So what we have is that the system, the political system that is running on the African continent is a problem. So you cannot be able to produce good leaders. The good leaders are always alienated from power. So they disappear from the continent. Some of them die prematurely. Some of them leave the continent and go outside. And we have seen this, that you have many Africans, prominent Africans, who are outside there on in the diaspora, whether in the United States, or, the Western world, or in China, and they have accomplished tremendous things, but they are alienated from power. Okay, and these are the people we need to be at the helm of transforming these countries. Imagine if Dangote was the one running the country in Nigeria. I mean, it could be transformed easily, because even when he's not in power, he's able to put up a facility which will serve the country about 4% of its GDP, about $30 billion every year, which is being spent on the importation of oil. But other heads of state, they cannot do it all over the African continent. So it shows you that we have a problem of leadership, and there's a failure of leadership. But this failure of leadership is due to an imported political system, and we have to understand that clearly. So this has made the African heads of state not to live up to expectations, because they do not have independence, the same independence. They do not have the courage. So this brings me to the second point, which is fear and cowardice. To some extent, there's cowardice within the African heads of state. There's cowardice, and of course, some level of selfishness is also existent. But there's a lot of cowardice, to the point that no one wants to challenge the United States. No one wants to challenge the colonial system. And Nkrumah is someone who was willing to challenge the status quo. He was someone who was willing to challenge the colonial system and overthrow it, and say we can manage our affairs. Actually, Nkrumah's life is set out. His thinking is set out even in the speech which he gave at its independence in Ghana in 1957. And he said that we are going to set out our own, we are going to mold our own African personality. We're going to create our own African personality and identity. All right. This is what Nkrumah said. We're going to create our own African personality and identity. And of course, this is similar to what President Thabo Mbeki, the former president of South Africa, normally talks about. He talks about African renaissance, coming back to Africa. But of course, President Thabo Mbeki's thinking, I believe that it is hollow. It's somehow hollow. It is lacking in some way, because while he's talking about the African renaissance and African thinking, or what Nkrumah, of course, called the African personality and identity. Thabo Mbeki, at the same time, he's talking about maintaining democracy, maintaining this and this, maintaining the colonial systems, and protecting what South Africa, whatever it has. So he has that kind of thinking. From my understanding, I see him in that direction. So there has been cowardice. There has been cowardice on the side of the African heads of state, that they have desired to enjoy the fruits of power and not challenge the system. So they prefer sort of like, if you cannot beat them, join them. So they have decided to join the imperialists. And you look at people like President Nana Addo, who's going out of power by December this year. When he came to power, he saw all the wrong things when he was outside. And when he came to power, not just when he was outside, when President Nana Addo came to power, he saw the wrong things in Ghana. And he said that the economy is owned by foreigners. It is not right. It is not right that Ghanaians do not own part of the economy. All the economy, major sectors, the driving sectors of the economy: gold, cocoa, copper, gold, cocoa, and oil, and the financial sector. These are the cores of the economy of Ghana. These are the principal sectors that make up the Ghanaian economy. But all of them are controlled by foreigners. So President Nana Addo saw this and said that it is not right for foreigners to control an economy like this. The Ghanaians have to do something. But of course, he never did anything. And of course, he came with a lot of optimism, and a lot of people had a lot of hope in him. We were very optimistic. A lot of Pan-Africans were very optimistic in him. But he saw it the easy way. He took the easy way and joined the imperialists. And we saw him even at the United States US Africa Summit, in the US in 2022, betraying Burkina Faso and selling out Burkina Faso to the United States. So he decided to join them. So there's a lack of courage. Cowardice has taken over. Okay, and selfishness has been mixed with cowardice. So then they lack the same courage like Nkrumah had. Remember, we are answering the question of, have the current heads of state lived up to expectations, and have they followed to live up to Nkrumah's legacy? They have not. They have not been able to transform the African economy, as we have seen. They have not been able to defend the continent from external aggression. We saw that the United States and NATO came and attacked Libya in 2011. Nigeria, under Jonathan Goodluck, who was the president of Nigeria during that period, and President Jacob Zuma, unfortunately, of South Africa, who was saying that he's fighting for the interests of the Africans. President Jacob Zuma, South Africa under President Jacob Zuma, and Nigeria under Jonathan Goodluck, they played a role in voting at the United Nations for a no-fly zone over Libya. So you would think that these guys know better, but they participated in the destruction. So they have not played a major role in the defense of the African continent. And what happened later, we are hearing terrorism all over the Sahel. And who brought this terrorism is the United States and NATO, because of their interest in this region. And it's because of the resources, of course. They are using this as a pretext because they want to control the continent. So they push all kind of propaganda in the region. They push even the terrorists, and they sponsor these terrorists by themselves to claim that these are independent terrorists, some sort of Al-Qaeda. How did the Al-Qaeda cross all the way from the Middle East to come to Africa? And it is simply because they are being chased from the Middle East. And this is what we are seeing. So the African heads of state have not been able to defend the African continent. They have not been able to transform the continent, economically. They have not been able to defend the African continent from external aggression. And we see that they don't want to challenge the international status quo. They really do not want to challenge it. There's negligence. And on speaking of negligence, I will share an article here, which was in which President Thabo Mbeki, of course, spoke about the fact that there has been a decline. There has been a decline in Pan-Africanism, all right? And the borders have become a problem. So in this article, which was published about 2 weeks ago, it is saying that the problem of non-seamless borders in Africa, is exacerbated by the decline in commitment to Pan-Africanism. The problem of decline in commitment to Pan-Africanism is the problem, which is coming and is leading to similar, non-seamless borders in Africa, because these heads of state, instead of protecting the whole African continent from imperialism, they are concentrating on their petty borders, which don't make any sense. They do not make any sense. The borders do not make any sense. And so you hear things like xenophobia in South Africa, against fellow Africans, instead of attacking the people who are controlling the economy, the imperialists who are controlling the economy, they are attacking their fellow Africans. And of course, which is unfortunate. And of course, we see that President Mbeki has defended the Africans in South Africa and said that South Africans are not xenophobic, but there's something which is driving them behind. There's somebody who's manipulating. And of course, he points to interference by imperialistic powers. And of course, the capitalists, they are the ones who are manipulating this to make it look like Africans are different. And so this is what he said, that the continuous challenge of non-seamless borders in the African continent, despite efforts, has been blamed on the decline in commitment to Pan-Africanism and a larger, political problem. So that is why I say that everything is political. Whether you like it or not, you have to participate in politics because it shapes your life. Whether you like it or not, it shapes your life. So there has been failure in that regard. There has been failure in defending the continent. There has been failure, in adhering to the principles of Pan-Africanism, just like what Nkrumah did. And there has been failure even in unifying or integrating the interests of the continent with the African diaspora. And because we see the African continent and the Union, we see the African Union, of course, created the sixth region of the African Union. But we also see that in 2011, when Haiti applied to join the African Union, it was rejected. So there has been decline in Pan-Africanism, and that's what he's talking about. This decline in Pan-Africanism is the one which has set the continent backwards, because we cannot develop, like I said, in our small states. They are not viable economically. They cannot compete with the rest of the world. Look, Europe, so far, with all its technology, now cannot compete with China. Its automobile industry, Europe's automobile industry right now cannot compete with that of China. Why? Because China is huge. Now, how can you say that South Africa will be able to produce cars, vehicles, and compete with China? Simply because you have to have access to a big market and you have to produce at scale. And countries like Uganda, who are producing vehicles, and Nigeria, they do not have money to invest to produce and compete with companies like Tesla or BYD from China, who are producing at scale. They are producing like maybe 5 to 9 to 10 million vehicles every year. Just to give you, an understanding, the Ugandan company called Kira Motors produced the first electric vehicles before Ford, even before BYD, even before companies like NIO and a lot of other companies like VW in 2011. That is when the first electric car was produced in Uganda. But up to now, they have not commercialized. Now, companies like NIO in China, which produced later on in 2018 their first electric car, they have sold over 300,000 electric vehicles. In Uganda, zero electric vehicle. Why? Because you do not have disposal to the resources as a small country, but as a continent, we have those resources. As a small country, you don't have those resources to put up the factories rapidly. Tesla built a factory in Shanghai, an electric vehicle factory in Shanghai, and Tesla built that factory in less than 6 months. In 9 months, it had started producing. Now, in Uganda, they are building an electric vehicle manufacturing factory since 2011. All right. Of course, they started talking about it in 2011. 2018, that is when they got their first money. Up to now, they are still building. They have not even produced their first vehicle for commercialization. They produce some vehicles which are just prototype, but they have not sold any vehicle. They have not sold any vehicle. They have not produced any vehicles to produce. And what does this say? I'm simply trying to point out that the economic viability of the small states on the African continent is zero. They are not viable. They cannot compete with China. They cannot compete with Europe. Even Europe, with all its technology, like I said, is struggling right now because China is so big, it's a big country. They cannot compete. So now look at Africa, who doesn't even have technology, and even the small countries which don't have even the money. You don't have the money, you don't have the market, and you don't have the resources. Now, how can you compete with all this power? So you have to produce at scale. Now we have to be together. We have to integrate. And these are the ideas Nkrumah had, which transcend time. These are the ideas which transcend the time that Nkrumah coined, we put down. And of course, he took these ideas, of course, from, he was just advancing the ideas of Honorable Marcus Garvey. But he advanced these ideas and put them on the ground and started them. Honorable Marcus Garvey had a vision. And of course, he was trying to build it from the United States and across the Atlantic. But Nkrumah came and he tried to implement that vision. Okay, he had a dream. Okay, Marcus Garvey had a dream. Let us say a dream, and Nkrumah transformed that dream into a vision and partially a reality, and started implementing it on the African continent. And that is how, of course, we got the African Union. Because without Nkrumah, we would not even have got it. Of course, like we said, we don't agree with what the African Union is doing because it's not performing what it is supposed to do, and it is simply because it was paralyzed. The African Union was paralyzed. Imperialism took it over. It conquered it. So because it conquered it, imperialism conquered it, that is how it was taken over. It has not been able to work. But that does not mean that the institution was not formed on the tenets of Pan-Africanism. And the element of Pan-Africanism is still existent in the institution itself. And so what we have to do is just to rescue this institution. We have to find a way to fight and take over the institution back again so that it can serve the interests of the people. And that means throwing out the people who are there, who are complacent within the institution itself. So the institution was built on the ideas of Pan-Africanism. And if it was not Nkrumah, that institution, we would not even have it today. We would not have the Pan-African Parliament. Today, many of you don't even know that we have the Pan-African Parliament in South Africa. We have a Pan-African Parliament. That is where it sits. It sits in South Africa. The member states of the African continent, they normally send about 4 members of parliament from each of the African continent. So I want that people to understand. And all these are ideas which Nkrumah put up. These are all Nkrumah's ideas. All right. And of course, this was a dream by Marcus Garvey, and Nkrumah came and transformed that into a vision and partially a reality. But all these are realities which were brought about by Nkrumah. But we were supposed to intensify. We were supposed to intensify our fight and our struggle in actualizing these realities. And this is one of the things which the African heads of state have failed. So the African heads of state, on all grounds, economically, politically, have failed. Regardless of how you look at it, you can look at the partial gains, the partial successes in places like Botswana, but even in Botswana, they are still struggling to take back the resources from companies like De Beers. And we saw this with President Masisi of Botswana, trying to push these companies which are mining diamond in Botswana so that they can give Botswana more resources, access to its resources. And we see that they are still resisting. So it shows you that even that is not success. We can talk about Mauritius. Maybe the other places you talk about that is success is Mauritius. But Mauritius is far from the continent. It's an island. It's a small country. But even also Botswana itself is a small country. Even if it has had success, it's just 4 million people, 4 to 5 million people. So it is insignificant compared to 1.4 billion people all over the African continent. So this means simply that in the whole, the African heads of state have failed politically, economically, in Pan-Africanism wise, in unifying the African people on the continent and in the diaspora. They have not bridged that gap in the same way that Nkrumah bridged the gap. And we had, Malcolm X visiting here and coordinating, of course, which the United States did not like. Dr. King coming here and being inspired and going back to the United States. And when Dr. King went back to the United States, of course, he intensified the fight after Ghana got its independence, and he intensified the fight. From 1957 and 1964, the Civil Rights Bill was signed. And all this was inspiration, which was also coming from the African continent and Nkrumah, basically. So we had all this bridging that the Africans across the Atlantic and on the continent were communicating. The African heads of state have failed in that regard. And of course, you can talk of whatever is happening between the Africa Import and Export Bank and the fact that it has established a branch in the Caribbean, trying to bridge that gap. But it has not been significant as it's supposed to be. And being significant is supposed to be demonstrated in our relationship with the African diaspora, and also economically we are supposed to advance forward and share this knowledge. So we have a problem there. The other thing which we see as a failure, of course, we've spoken about on the international stage. Recently, this week, there has been a vote at the United Nations on the issue of Palestine. All right. We know that under Nkrumah, Africa played a major role. Africa played a major role when it came to when it came to international politics at the United Nations, of course, defending its interests, but also defending the interests of the rest of the world. Now, when we look at this, this is the voting at a recent issue regarding Israel's occupation of Palestine. Now, the way Africa also votes at this particular situation, because the vote, of course, succeeded tremendously. It condemned, a resolution was passed by United Nations General Assembly. It was adopted, and it demanded that Israel brings to an end its unlawful presence in occupied Palestinian territory without delay. Of course, we know that Israel is over there killing people, murdering, causing a genocide in Palestine, Gaza, and killing innocent Palestinian people. Now, this speaks to the question of colonialism and freedom and self-determination. The Africans struggled with imperialism, but today, even though this resolution, of course, was able to pass, but the patterns of Africa's voting at the United Nations also paint something very difficult, and it's not good to imagine. We should not, going in this direction. You can see that countries like Malawi, which is an African country, voted against this resolution. So basically, Malawi, what is saying, it does not believe that Israel should come out. So it shows you that there's uncoordination. Africans are not coordinated. Africans are not coordinated. Now, there was abstention by a lot of African countries. Ethiopia, we know that the Emperor Haile Selassie moved all across the world, trying to ask for support. Even went to the United Nations to ask for support when Mussolini and the Italian government was invading Ethiopia. Ethiopia abstained, and this is not very good. Kenya abstained. This is not very good. This is not very good for a continent which knows about colonialism. Democratic Republic of Congo abstained. Okay? Haiti abstained. For black people who very well know what colonialism is and which colonialism Israel is trying to impose on the Palestinian people, this is not good. It's not a good picture. It shows that we don't have a position. And of course, we saw Liberia also voted in the same manner, and it is unfortunate. It is unfortunate. Rwanda also voted. This should be a shame. This should be a complete shame that African countries decided to vote in this manner, yet we know very well what colonialism is. Rwanda knows how we were divided, how the genocide in Rwanda was caused by colonialists. France, Belgium, we know that these are the colonialists. It's the same colonialism that is happening in Palestine. We know this. So it is a shame that Liberia, Rwanda, Ethiopia, Kenya, okay, they were able to abstain. Democratic Republic of Congo, who are all African countries, abstained from this important issue whereby we should condemn Israel's activities, that it should come out from Palestine. We are supposed to be part of this. And of course, it is unfortunate that a country like Malawi, of a leader who gave a speech when Magufuli died to try to portray himself as a Pan-Africanist, he would vote against this resolution of independence, of self-determination for the Palestinians, of stopping the genocide. So this also paints a very bad picture. And it also shows you that we are in trouble. With the current leadership, we are in trouble on the African continent. And it shows you that they are not living up to expectations. They are not following the legacy of Kwame Nkrumah as we are looking at him. So that is what it is. That is what it is now when we look at this particular situation. So we have looked at it from the economic point of view. We have looked at it from the political point of view, governance on the African continent. We have looked at it from from the Pan-African point of view, the integration, the relationship between Africans on the continent and the Africans in the diaspora, we have looked at it on the international scale when it comes to foreign affairs, our relationship with the rest of the world. The African heads of state are failing on all these parameters, and Nkrumah is still very relevant. This is what makes him very, very relevant. They are uncoordinated. They have not even done enough work. Even they cannot visit each other. African countries, they don't have good relations with each other, as we saw, as we saw Nana Akufo-Addo snitching and selling out Burkina Faso, a neighbor to Ghana, instead of going to Burkina Faso and having a conversation with them, because they are our brothers. He decided to go to the United States and snitch on Burkina Faso before the United States. So to submit himself, he decided to submit himself before the United States, instead of speaking to his brother. So it shows you that the relationship between African countries is lacking. Nkrumah's policy, primarily his foreign policy, was towards Africa before anywhere across the world. So he wanted to have, first of all, good relationship. His policy, his foreign policy, was geared towards understanding Africa and having good cooperation towards Africa. Now, this takes us to the final point that we want to address, and we'll go through this very quickly. The responsibility now. What do we do going forward? What is the way forward? And are we ready to walk in Nkrumah's shoes in this generation? Our generation, is it ready to walk in Nkrumah's shoes? Are we able to take on the responsibility of what Nkrumah left us behind? Okay, so this, of course, whether we are ready or not, which we have to be ready if we want to serve this continent and be free for the next 500 years, 5 to 1,000 years. There's an opportunity which has arisen, of course, in this generation. As we had President Xi Jinping when he was in Moscow, I think it was last year, talking to President Putin, and said that they are driving the changes which are happening today. They have never happened in 100 years. And China and Russia, they are the ones driving them. So there's a window of opportunity. Now, this means that all these shortcomings, all these problems that the African heads of state have exposed us to us, they have exposed us to, we have now to look to Nkrumah and tap into Nkrumah's understanding of neocolonialism and a neocolonial system. Because whether you like it or not, this is a European dispensation. We are living in a European dispensation. So it is just that the East, led by China and Russia, they are just to upset that dispensation so that everyone can be free all across the world. But we are living in a European dispensation. So we have then to understand that system. We have to tap into Nkrumah's understanding of that system. Nkrumah very well understood, even though he had hoped that the United States would help Africa to industrialize. And actually, even when he became the leader of business in Ghana, he traveled to the United States, I think it was 1958, and he appealed to the Africans in the diaspora, who are the African Americans, to come to Africa and contribute, come to Ghana, poor in number, technicians, whatever, come and contribute. And of course, this is why Nkrumah stands out as someone who bridged the gap, which we are talking about, true Pan-Africanism. He lived Pan-Africanism. Now, we have to understand that this has to be done. We have to understand that this gap, we also have to bridge it as a people. All right, we have to bridge it as a people, as Nkrumah did, as he understood. So we have to tap into him and understand that, one, without working with the African diaspora, without the continent, without the African people on the continent, those who are going to lead the next generation, who are going to lead the new continent that we envision as Pan-Africanists, a continent which is built on the ideals of our forefathers and foremothers. You can talk of Amy Ashwood Garvey, you can talk of Miriam Makeba, you can talk of Winnie Mandela, you can talk of George Padmore, Malcolm X. What continent did they envision? Marcus Garvey, what continent did they envision? That continent which they envisioned, not the one for today. The continent today is what imperialism envisioned, the one which does not move forward, the one which does not make progress, the one which constantly struggles. That's what imperialism envisioned. And that continent, that vision, that socialized continent was achieved in 1966 when Nkrumah was overthrown. That is when imperialism consolidated its position on the African continent, because Nkrumah was the biggest critic Nkrumah was imperialism's arch enemy on the African continent and even on the global stage. Okay, so when they removed him from power in 1966, that is when imperialism consolidated its position on the African continent. So we are living in a continent which imperialism envisioned, a continent which struggles constantly and does not use its resources for its benefit and benefit of its people. And that is why we are seeing what is happening in Nigeria, that imperialists are ganging up against Dangote. Okay, the multinational companies, Shell, Chevron, BP, Total, okay, ExxonMobil, all these are ganging up against the Dangote oil refinery. Now, what they are doing is that they are forcing him to import crude oil so that his refined fuel will be expensive in Nigeria, and they will not buy it in Nigeria, so that Nigeria will continue to import cheap crude oil from the West. And now they are dropping down the barrel of crude so that there can be cheap refined fuel in the West, and the cheap refined fuel would be imported into Nigeria, and Dangote's fuel will continue to be expensive and destroy the refinery. So this is what they are trying to do. So that is the continent which imperialism envisioned. They envisioned a continent which constantly struggles. They wanted the continent to continue to struggle. Okay, and that is what we are going through right now. So we are living in a continent which imperialism envisioned. Now, how do we upset that to move to the continent which our forefathers envisioned? A prosperous one, rapidly growing, and which takes care of all its children on the continent and those in the diaspora. Both on the continent and those in the diaspora. That's the continent our forefathers envisioned. It means that we have to go back to understand what Nkrumah was doing. What was he doing? Working with the Africans in the diaspora. Number two, taking responsibility. We have to understand that while our forefathers took the responsibility in their era, it is our era now. This generation also has to understand that we have now the responsibility. The responsibility is on our shoulder, regardless of the challenges that we may have. We may have those challenges, but our ancestors too had their own challenges. The Nkrumahs had their own challenges. The two Salovachas, mind you, they had even more challenges than us. They never had communication systems. They didn't own even their bodies. Their bodies were sold off. So we have to understand that we have a responsibility. We have a responsibility towards the continent. And we have to go back to the analysis that was done. We don't even need to do new analysis. Nkrumah has already done the analysis. And he has taught us who the problem is for the African people, the African continent, the arch enemy of the African people, the perpetual enemy of the African people, the declared enemy of the African people is imperialism and is European imperialism, basically. And that is the enemy at the top of the pyramid. The top of the pyramid of the problems that are facing the African continent is not corruption like what other people say. It's not this and that. It's not human rights. It's not women's rights or whatever you can call it. You can even call it chicken rights. It's not animal rights or it's not gay rights. The top most problem at the top of the pyramid, the problem affecting the African continent is imperialism. And this can be found in Nkrumah's works. You can go out there and read Nkrumah's works. So leave alone what imperialism is trying to confuse you and socialize the African people into thinking that they should concentrate on social problems. And actually, this was also stated in the memorandum, National Security Memorandum 46. The FBI says, the United States government said that they should have the African people in the United States, who are the African Americans, concentrate on social and economic issues so that they should abandon their political, aspirations, their hopes, their political and social, their political aspirations, their political hopes and aspirations. They say that they should create conditions where they will concentrate on social and economic issues to solve those, so that they will abandon their political ambitions of having a share or separating even themselves from the United States and creating their own country within the United States. All right. So that is what the United States wanted to achieve. And so that is what it does even on the African continent. The African heads of state, they come and they overwhelm them with solving human rights instead of concentrating on the one most important issue that is going to rescue the continent once and for all, which is the fight against imperialism. And the fight against imperialism, you cannot do it unless you have a Pan-African perspective, a unification of the African continent. So they try to deflect them from thinking that way, so that they can concentrate on the petty things, fight for human rights, give the women their rights, continuously fight for this. This is what they are trying to do. So now this generation has to understand the problem from the top to the bottom. What is the hierarchy of the problems that are affecting the continent? And Nkrumah has done this analysis already in his books, Africa Must Unite, Neo-Colonialism, The Last Stage of Imperialism. He has done extensive analysis in one of his most important and most powerful work called the Philosophical Consensusism, the philosophy of decolonization. So that book is very important. These are the three most important books, I think, to my understanding. Africa Must Unite, Neo-Colonialism, The Last Stage of Imperialism, and Philosophical Consensusism. These, they lay out clearly Nkrumah's philosophy and what he wants us to achieve. And he points out clearly that the biggest problem on the African continent is imperialism. And when we defeat imperialism, then the next stage we have to go there is the collaborators of imperialism. And of course, that includes the African heads of state who have enabled. There can be conscious and unconscious collaborators on the African continent, but I believe there's a lot of collaborators on the African continent. And the collaborators don't only stop on the heads of state, but they are also inside the continent itself, whether it's ministers, whether it's some of the working people who work for these multinational corporations, which are Western. And of course, you can talk about the KFCs, whatever, all these organizations, mining companies. So we have to understand those. Okay, so we have to take responsibility, and we have to go with the right analysis of the problem and understand what the problem is, and stop wondering and going to fight for chicken rights and gay rights instead of looking at what the real problem is that will defeat imperialism. And the problem at the top, the problem at the peak of the problem, of the pyramid, the problem at the peak of the pyramid is imperialism, followed by the collaborators on the African continent. Once you defeat that and you consolidate the gains on the African continent, then you will be able to unify the continent. Of course, in the process of unifying this continent, you are going to fight against these two groups. These are the most important groups. These are most critical groups that we have to fight against. When you defeat those, then you are ready to reconstruct the continent, because the resources now will stop flowing out of the continent. But then even you don't need to take my words alone. Go to the United Nations report, which was published in 2021, all right, on the illicit financial outflow out of the African continent. That report shows where Africa is losing money to. And the report points out to illicit financial outflow. Okay. Basically, what illicit financial outflow is theft. What they mean by illicit financial outflow is theft, that they are stealing. Okay. Now, this illicit financial outflow, they say that the leader in this illicit financial outflow, it was the Western corporations, mining companies. So then it shows you that the lead of the problem on the African continent is imperialism. So even the United Nations report shows you that. So the lead problem is actually not even corruption. That is not the lead problem. So corruption is just a symptom, okay? It's just a part of the major problem. And corruption is just used as a tool by imperialism to continue the exploitation of the African continent, working with its collaborators, of course, internally in the African continent. Now, we need to understand this. So that is why it is important to read the works of our ancestors and what they analyze. We don't need even to invent anything new. And what is the solution? The solution is to fight against this system. And it has to be defeated and overthrown, and bringing a new system on the African continent, a new governance system, the unification and installing a new political system on the African continent, which brings into power the best in society. That is the system that we have to look for. That is the system we have to work with. And of course, there's going to be obstacles. There's going to be obstacles to this, but this generation has to confront those obstacles. Just like I said, the generation of Toussaint Louverture in Haiti, San Domingo, and the generation of Nkrumah, they confronted their own shortcomings and their obstacles that time. We also have to confront our own, because we have even much more advantages during our period. Those people were slaves and didn't own anything. They didn't own even their bodies. During colonialism, the Nkrumahs did not have anything, but they fought. They did not have the communication means like what we have today. Okay, but they fought. So we have to confront this problem head on and be able to defeat it. And we have to do it within our generation, definitely. And we have to understand that we have to start the reconstruction process, because Africa has three key important aspects which will help us to reconstruct it. One, the population. Okay, this is the most important resource the continent has. We have all the ingredients which are necessary for us to take off and become a superpower in the next 20 years to become a $65 trillion economy. We have the tools as Africans. We have the population, number one. Okay, we have a GDP of $3.5 trillion. That is the economy. All right. So the population on the continent itself is around 3.4. If you add the diaspora, we are the biggest population across the world. If you add the diaspora, we could be even around 1.8 billion people. Right now on the continent alone is 1.4 billion people. But if you add the diaspora, we could be around 1.8 billion people. We are the biggest nation across the world. Now, unify that, you have the biggest market, more than China. You can build the corporations on the African continent and they will succeed even before anyone else. So our number one resource, most important resource, is our population. But that population has to be unified into a single market, and not in the manner in which the African Union is doing, whereby it's trying to unify the market without unifying the political system, without industries, without infrastructure. So what are you unifying if you don't have infrastructure? You are unifying the market, but you don't have infrastructure. So that's what basically the African Union is doing. You don't have infrastructure, and the political system is not unified itself. And so these are huge problems and shortcomings of what they are doing. So we have to unify the market itself, and that market is going to come from the advantage of us people. Now, number two, we have a big economy. If we unify the African continent, $3.5 trillion, our economy could be almost equal to that of India. But we have seen that India is going to space. India is manufacturing its own even fighter jets, its own aircraft, trains, vehicles. It has its own vehicle companies. India has been able to buy Range Rover, Land Rover, the company which is manufacturing Land Rover, Freelanders, and all these. It was a British company, and India has bought it. Tata has bought it. We don't have any of those companies which are competing on the international stage. Yet we have the same economy as a continent. Now, we have to identify these are all opportunities. I'm just speaking about these are opportunities for us to see. Number three, we have immense resources. Even more than India, our continent is 12 times the size of India, yet we have the same population. So we have more resources than India. The size of we have more land than India. Our land is 12 times that of India, and yet we have the same population. So basically, the continent is underpopulated, the African continent. So we have resources of up to $700 trillion in ground, but those resources now are being enjoyed by foreign powers. We have seen Europe has built itself, the United States has built itself on our resources. China is also building itself on our resources. Copper, just a few weeks ago, just last week, copper was transported from the Democratic Republic of Congo through Angola, through the Lobito corridor, and it was sent to Baltimore in the United States to build their own electric cars. We are not building our own electric cars on the African continent. So the resources continue to benefit foreigners who are foreign to the African continent. Who's aiding that is the African heads of state. So number three important resource which we have is our material resources, up to $700 trillion. We have enough resources. Number four is our geopolitical location as African continent. Geopolitical location in the whole world. We are in the middle of the world. Look at the map of the world. We are in the middle, which means if you start manufacturing in the world, you should be able to ship anywhere. You should be able to set up industries all across the African continent and ship your merchandise anywhere across the African continent, across the world, anywhere across the world cheaply. So what we have been working on, basically, just to give you a sneak peek, myself and my organization called, the Africa Continental Unity Party, which is ACAP, and my company called the Century Rail, we have been working on a continental railway platform. All right, and of course, these are projects which we are working on. So you need unified infrastructure on the African continent. So number one, you have your resources, you have your population, you have your GDP ready to take off. You have capital, you have all the factors of production, you have the materials, and you are geopolitically, strategically located. Okay, so you can manufacture for Europe, you can manufacture for America on the western coast of the African continent, you can manufacture for Asia on the eastern part of the continent, you can manufacture in the northern part of the continent for Europe and the Arab world. So more than anyone else, we are so much endowed, we have so much opportunities that the only problem that we are facing that we have to remove right now is imperialism, because that is the biggest problem that is affecting the continent. And this is, of course, according to Nkrumah's analysis, no one else. And we know that Nkrumah, of course, was voted in 2000 as the African man of the millennium for the last 1,000 years. African man of the millennium, BBC, the VVC took a toll. They took, a vote on Africans, and the Africans voted that Nkrumah was the African man of the millennium, even ahead of Mandela. Okay, he was more popular than Mandela. And yet Nkrumah died way back in 1972, when many of the people who were voting him were not born. So this speaks to Nkrumah's relevance. And that means that we have to take on the mantle and take on the responsibility within this generation. That responsibility, we have to take it on within this generation. Thank you so much for those who have been listening to me. Please like the video. Like the video. I want you to like the video and share. Share the video with other people. And support the channel, please. Support the channel. Give us a super chat. I've been here talking the whole day. And thank you to James Starks from DC, Washington, DC, I think. You supported us with the super chat. Please support us with the super chat. Support us with that super chat. Support us in our PayPal account. We will be very, very glad. So I'll go out to the comment section just to read out a few of the comments. Thank you, James Starks, once again for that super chat to the channel. Thank you for supporting the channel and supporting the work that we are doing. That is very important. It keeps us going. This is very, very important. It's extremely important. I could go on, like I said, and talk about Nkrumah almost for 2 complete days, because his achievements are almost superhuman. They are superhuman. And the fact that he loved not only the Africans on the continent, but Africans globally, because Nkrumah understood that for us to rebuild the African continent, we have to work with the African diaspora. Okay, so let me just go through the comments and see what you guys are saying in the comment section. We have trade apartheid. It is unnatural and manipulated. This is AK Ando, depopulation, Kissinger's directive. Okay. 80% of natural resources traded on the London stock market is of African origin. Actually, this Nkrumah mentioned it even in his book. In Imperialism, Neocolonialism, the last stage of imperialism. Irish, yes. Are you acknowledging the West's interference and obstructionism? Of course, absolutely. At the top of the problems, the challenges that Africa is facing, at the top of the pyramid is imperialism. I've already mentioned that. We need a new analysis. No, we don't need new analysis. We just need to adopt. We just need to adopt what Nkrumah analyzed. We don't really need to, from Gavi to Nkrumah, the fight was the same. The fight was the same, and the fight was against imperialism. And Gavi understood this very well. Okay, Gavi understood this very well. That is why he was saying that we need to build up capital here, build up system and enterprise here, and then go back to Africa and rebuild Africa. Because Gavi understood that economic power alone is not enough. You have to have political power. And so Gavi was just using political power to build up political power and bring it to Africa to get the political. He was building up economic power in the US to bring that economic power to Africa and build the political power in Africa. So, and he faced, of course, a lot of challenges. Nkrumah did not properly account for Francophonie on the continent, Franc-Afrique on the continent. I think he tried. Nkrumah had so much work to do. We need updated analysis tailored to current, interference by the forces who require Africa to stay underdeveloped. No, the analysis was done already. The analysis was done already. So what new material are you going to invent? You're not going to invent any new material. People who wrote in Neocolonialism, the last stage of imperialism, how Europe underdeveloped Africa, all these guys have already shown you what the problem is, and that problem is the same. It's just the way in which it is operating. Maybe the tools is just the tools which you need to adopt, because those tools, they can evolve. The tools which you are going to use to fight against this system, but the operation is the same. The system is the same that is oppressing us, and is imperialism and neocolonialism. So basically, there's nothing new that we are going to invent as a people. African unity is African empowerment, those at home and abroad. Absolutely. I do agree. These imperialist forces are watching African consciousness, Pan-Africanism. Their operations are ongoing. We know that. The imperialists, of course, are watching the Africans who are fighting. They have tools. They have a lot of institutions, the FBI, CIA. But this does not mean that they will always win. Because if they were always watching, how then did we get independence? Because they were watching. right? They were watching. So how did we get independence? But they were defeated. How did the people, defeat slavery in Haiti? San Domingo, and defeat France, defeat Britain, and defeat Spain. They were watching. Okay, how did Dr. King and the civil rights movement achieve the Civil Rights Bill of 1964? These guys were always watching. Okay, but when the time has come, it is so you are supposed to move forward with conviction that you are going to win. Also, who is fighting against this imperialist system, this neo-colonial system and its oppression. The West cannot survive without Africa's resources. Of course, we know that Ghana was a British colony. Absolutely, we know that. The fix the fix was in already. So I also believe Tafawa Balewa, Nigeria's first prime minister, was the first to address the Joint Congress of the US. Okay, we need to remain. It is a concerto abuse by the members of the Security Council, such as France, the US, and the United Kingdom. Import substitution is up to India and Brazil. Do you think it is a failure of incompetence or to trade apartheid? So it's a factor, it's a couple of factors, but we don't need to confuse ourselves and do our own analysis. We have experts. You see, the thing about Nkrumah is that Nkrumah was not somebody who spoke from the side, okay, who was just an analysis with, like most of us or most of the people who are talking about Pan-Africanism and the problems of the continent. Nkrumah was a player, all right? He was in the field and saw the problems firsthand. Whether it is imperialism, he dealt with it firsthand. Whether it is espionage of the CIA and the Department of Intelligence agents, the Department of State, the FBI, Nkrumah dealt with these problems firsthand. So when people like Nkrumah do an analysis, that is it. That is it. You don't need even to go again and start looking for different solutions and this and that. You can adopt the methods you are using to fight, but the problem you are fighting, he has already analyzed it for you. So you just need to build on what he has done. That you don't go back to zero and start doing your own analysis. It has already been done. The Chinese, what have they done? They have already succeeded. Mao Zedong of China, how they succeeded and they fought against the system and they defeated it. How did they do it? These guys have succeeded. China has succeeded. Can we go and study? We don't need to invent new things and then start saying this corruption is the problem. This is not the problem. There's nowhere where corruption has ever stopped a country from developing. All right? There's nowhere. Even today, the United States Congress, the members of Congress, even Nancy Pelosi, when she was still a Speaker of Congress, she was doing insider trading. This is corruption. This is absolute corruption. It's just that this is high-tech corruption. And their corruption is so bad to the extent that it leads to the death of millions. Iraq, Libya, Afghanistan. Have you ever seen this level of corruption in Africa, whereby you go in and kill 1 million people for nothing, completely nothing, out of lie? This is corruption. Corruption doesn't basically mean somebody taking, $5 or $10. That's not what corruption means. Corruption means like being unethical, completely unethical. So if you kill 1 million people, you kill 500,000 babies. United States imposed sanctions on Iraq, and they killed over 500,000 babies. Okay, and this is corruption. When you lie and you go and kill innocent people, 1 million people, and you kill your own over 10,000, because if you look at the people who died within the 9/11, about 3,000. You look at the soldiers who died in Iraq, the American soldiers themselves who died in Iraq, more than 6,000 to 7,000 soldiers died in Iraq. American soldiers. Now the Iraqi people who died there, more than 1 million people. But for what? All because of a lie that there was weapons of mass destruction. So if you cannot describe this as corruption, then what is corruption? So corruption is really not the problem. And even when you look at Nkrumah's analysis, he teaches us this is not the problem. He doesn't even mention it anywhere in his works. This is not the problem. This has been the tactic of imperialism to help to make you, to hold you concentrating on non-issues so that you neglect and you remove your eye from the real issues that are affecting you as a people. And that is the issue of imperialism. And as we have seen again, at the top of the robbery and the stealing of Africa's money and resources, which are flowing out of the continent, according to the United Nations, which is an imperialist organization, is around $90 billion every year. And the leader of that group who are stealing that money is Western institutions, banks, and mining companies and oil companies. And we have seen this in Nigeria already. We are seeing Shell, Total, we are seeing Chevron, we are seeing ExxonMobil. They are there, but Nigeria is suffering, doesn't have fuel. These companies are taking it to the West. So if you want to talk about corruption, what more can you talk about than this level of corruption? So we have to, I think we have to understand this. We don't need even to do new analysis on these particular issues. Anyway, my name is Kwame Gonza, and I thank you very much, you guys, for being part of this, for hanging in there with us. We are glad that you have been part of the program, of remembering Nkrumah as a person, his contribution, and of course, the guidance that he gives us going forward and what we should do about the situation that is going on across the world, and how it is affecting the African continent, what we should do about it to liberate ourselves from the grip of imperialism and neocolonialism, US imperialism, just to be precise, and European imperialism, because these are the arch enemies, these are the declared enemies of the African people. It is US imperialism, European imperialism combined, which is Western imperialism. That is the declared enemy of the African people, and there's no one who can dispute that, and there's no one who should confuse you about anything and tell you that it is corruption, which is the problem. It is not the problem, but imperialism, and that is what we have to fight against to be able to defeat this. Thank you so much. That has been a reflection on Nkrumah's legacy on this particular day when we celebrate his birthday as a person and his relevance in this changing world order as Africans. Thank you so much, and God bless you all. I'll see you another time. Peace to you all.